Welcome to Northern Mystery Archives. Here, we don't soften the truth, and we don't skip the details. We investigate the forgotten files from the far north of Canada, the disappearances that were quietly shelved, the settlements that faded from every map, the transmissions that were never meant to be heard again. In this channel, nothing is hidden. Every fragment, every silence, every erased trail is examined with the seriousness these cases deserved but never received. If you value cold, atmospheric, minimalist investigations into the unexplained wilderness of the North, you're in the right place. Subscribe, stay close, and step with us into the files they hoped no one would ever revisit. There are sections of the Northern Territories that never fully thaw, regions where spring arrives reluctantly, where ice clings to the edges of slow rivers well into May, and where entire communities can fade from official record with less resistance than you might imagine. This is a case file recovered from a provincial archive storage facility in the late 90s. The documents were misfiled, incorrectly dated, and partially damaged by moisture. What remains tells the story of a settlement that appeared on maps for less than 3 years before vanishing entirely. The case involves a single individual whose disappearance triggered the unraveling of an entire community's carefully constructed silence. The file is labeled Case Reference Northern Territory Incident 81-472. The primary subject is identified only as Avery Tomlin, occupation listed as contract surveyor, age 34 at time of last confirmed sighting. No surviving family contacts listed, no forwarding address provided. The investigation was opened, conducted for approximately 6 weeks, then abruptly suspended without formal conclusion. The closure documentation is missing. What exists instead is a collection of witness statements that contradict one another in small but significant ways. A series of photographs depicting structures that no longer appear on any contemporary survey maps, and radio logs that reference locations using designations that were never officially registered with territorial authorities. The incident occurred in a region approximately 400 kilometers northeast of a territorial administrative center, accessible only by winter road during frozen months or by float plane when conditions permitted. The nearest registered settlement was over 200 kilometers to the south. The area in question sits within a transitional zone, where boreal forest gives way gradually to tundra, where black spruce becomes sparse and stunted, where permafrost begins to dictate what can and cannot endure. It is not a region where people establish permanent residence without compelling reason. Avery Tomlin arrived in the area during the final weeks of winter, hired under a short-term contract to conduct preliminary surveys for a proposed forestry access road. The contract was issued by a regional development corporation that dissolved less than 18 months after Tomlin's disappearance. Attempts to trace corporate records in subsequent years yielded only partial documentation. What is known is that Tomlin was provided with lodging in a small settlement identified in the file only as Station 47. This designation does not correspond to any officially recognized place name. Maps from the period show nothing at those coordinates except unbroken wilderness and a notation indicating possible historical trapping outpost. The settlement, according to recovered testimonies, consisted of 11 permanent structures and a transient population that fluctuated between 20 and 35 individuals, depending on season and economic activity. Most residents were engaged in trapline maintenance, though several statements reference a small-scale logging operation and at least 2 mentions of mineral sampling work being conducted in the region. None of these activities appear in territorial economic reports from that period. The community had no official designation, no postal service, no registered land claims. It existed in a bureaucratic shadow, sustained by individuals who preferred minimal interaction with administrative oversight. Tomlin's contract required a 6-week presence in the area, conducting elevation surveys and soil composition analysis along a proposed corridor extending roughly 80 kilometers northward from the settlement. The surveyor was expected to file weekly progress reports via radio transmission to a regional office. For the first 3 weeks, these reports arrived as scheduled. They were brief, technical, unremarkable. The 4th week's transmission was delayed by 2 days and notably shorter than previous communications. The 5th week's report was fragmented, interrupted by apparent equipment malfunction, and contained references to landscape features that did not align with known topography. The 6th week, no transmission was received. Attempts to establish contact yielded only static and occasional broken fragments of speech that could not be clearly attributed to any identified source. A decision was made to dispatch an inquiry. What followed was a sequence of events that remains inadequately documented and profoundly unclear. The settlement at Station 47 was found abandoned, not gradually evacuated, but abruptly left. Personal belongings remained in dwellings. Food supplies sat undisturbed in storage. Station 47 existed at the edge of what could reasonably be called habitable territory. The landscape surrounding it was neither dramatically forbidding nor particularly welcoming. It was simply indifferent. The region consisted of low, rolling terrain, covered in dense stands of black spruce and tamarack, interspersed with areas of muskeg that became treacherous during thaw periods. Small lakes dotted the area, their shores lined with weathered granite outcrops, worn smooth by glacial action thousands of years prior. The soil was thin, acidic, poorly drained. Permafrost lay less than 2 meters beneath the surface in most locations, creating conditions that prevented deep root systems and ensured that any structure built there would eventually succumb to frost heave and gradual subsidence. The settlement itself occupied a slightly elevated area adjacent to a narrow river that flowed northward into a larger watershed system. The river provided access during ice-free months, though its shallow depth and frequent rapids made navigation challenging even for experienced operators. During winter, it became a highway of sorts, its frozen surface supporting the weight of vehicles and serving as the primary supply route for the community. The structures were modest, constructed primarily from milled lumber transported in during previous years. Most were single-story buildings with steep pitched roofs designed to shed snow accumulation. Insulation was adequate, but not exceptional. Heat was provided by wood stoves, with fuel sourced from the surrounding forest. Electricity came from a small diesel generator that operated on a limited schedule to conserve fuel. The inhabitants were a mixture of individuals drawn to the area for various reasons. Few of them openly discussed. Some were trappers, working established lines that had been in use for decades, passed down through informal agreements rather than legal transfer. Others were transient workers, arriving for seasonal employment and departing when conditions or opportunity dictated. A few appeared to be permanent residents, though their reasons for choosing such isolation were not recorded in any official documentation. Social structure was informal, governance minimal. Disputes were resolved internally. Assistance provided when needed. Privacy respected as a fundamental principle. It was a community held together not by shared identity, but by shared circumstances and mutual recognition that survival in such an environment required cooperation without intrusion. Communication with the outside world was limited and sporadic. A single radio transceiver provided the only reliable means of contact, operated according to a schedule that accommodated both incoming and outgoing transmissions. Supplies arrived irregularly, dependent on weather conditions and the availability of transport. During spring break-up and fall freeze-up, the settlement could be completely isolated for weeks at a time, accessible only by air if emergency required intervention. This isolation was not considered hardship by those who chose to remain. It was, in fact, the primary appeal. The ability to exist beyond the immediate reach of administrative systems, social expectations, and institutional oversight drew a particular type of individual to places like Station 47. Avery Tomlin arrived during the transition period between deep winter and early spring, when temperatures remained below freezing, but daylight hours were rapidly increasing. The surveyor came equipped with standard field gear, survey instruments, topographic maps, and provisions sufficient for the expected duration of the contract. Initial interactions with settlement residents were described in later testimonies as cordial, but reserved. Tomlin was provided with lodging in a small cabin at the eastern edge of the community, previously used for storage, but cleared and minimally furnished for temporary occupancy. The surveyor's daily routine involved departing at first light, conducting fieldwork along the proposed survey corridor, and returning before dark. Evenings were spent reviewing data, preparing reports, and maintaining equipment. The survey work itself was straightforward in concept but demanding in execution. The proposed road corridor extended through challenging terrain, requiring careful documentation of elevation changes, soil conditions, drainage patterns, and potential obstacles. Tomlin worked methodically, establishing survey markers at regular intervals and recording precise measurements that would later inform engineering assessments. The work was solitary, conducted in silence except for the sounds of wind moving through spruce branches and the occasional distant call of ravens. It was work that required attention to detail and tolerance for prolonged isolation, qualities that Tomlin appeared to possess in adequate measure. Weather during those initial weeks was typical for the region and season. Daytime temperatures hovered around -10°C, warming slightly during afternoons when sunlight penetrated the forest canopy. Nights remained deeply cold, often dropping below -25. Snow depth varied depending on location and wind exposure, ranging from less than 30 centimeters in open areas to over a meter in sheltered zones where drifting had occurred. Travel was conducted on snowshoes, or using a small snow machine provided by the settlement's informal equipment pool. Visibility was generally good, with clear skies predominating and occasional light snowfall that rarely impeded progress. The forest itself was ancient and largely undisturbed. Trees grew slowly in the harsh climate, their growth rings packed tightly in patterns that spoke of centuries of endurance. Deadfall accumulated gradually, creating tangles of weathered wood that provided habitat for small mammals and insulation for the forest floor. Moss covered exposed surfaces, and lichen hung from branches in pale green cascades. The ecosystem was sparse but resilient, adapted to survive conditions that would overwhelm more temperate species. The first indication that circumstances were deviating from expected patterns came during the 4th week of Tomlin's presence at Station 47. The surveyor's scheduled radio transmission arrived 2 days late and was noticeably brief. The report contained required technical data, but lacked the incidental observations that had characterized earlier communications. When questioned about the delay, Tomlin attributed it to equipment difficulties and mentioned unexpectedly challenging terrain conditions in the northern section of the survey corridor. The explanation was accepted without particular concern. Equipment malfunctions were common in extreme cold, and terrain assessments conducted from topographic maps often failed to capture localized difficulties that only became apparent during ground-level survey work. The 5th week's transmission was more troubling. It arrived on schedule, but was interrupted multiple times by what operators described as unusual interference. Tomlin's voice was described as strained, and the technical content of the report was less organized than previous submissions. More significantly, the surveyor made references to landscape features that did not correspond to known topography. Mention was made of a structural complex approximately 15 kilometers north of Station 47, described as appearing to be abandoned industrial infrastructure of undetermined age and purpose. This was perplexing because no industrial activity had ever been documented in that area. Forestry operations had never extended that far north. Mineral exploration had been limited to preliminary sampling decades earlier, and no transportation infrastructure existed that would have supported significant development. When asked to clarify the observation, Tomlin described a series of low buildings, partially buried by snow accumulation, constructed from what appeared to be corrugated metal and weathered timber. The structures were arranged in a rough, rectangular pattern surrounding a central cleared area. No identifying markings were visible, and access routes had long since been reclaimed by vegetation and erosion. The surveyor expressed uncertainty about whether to document the site in the official survey report, as it lay outside the designated corridor and was not relevant to the road feasibility assessment. The radio operator advised Tomlin to photograph the site if practical and include coordinates in the next transmission for possible follow-up investigation. The transmission ended with acknowledgement of that instruction. The sixth week produced no communication whatsoever. Initial attempts to establish contact were unsuccessful, yielding only static and occasional bursts of fragmented audio that could not be clearly resolved into comprehensible speech. This continued for 3 days before a decision was made to investigate. The delay was not considered unusual at the time. Radio equipment failure was common, particularly in extreme cold or during periods of atmospheric disturbance. Moreover, Tomlin was operating in remote territory where assistance could not be rapidly deployed. A certain amount of self-reliance was expected, and premature response to minor difficulties was generally discouraged as resource-intensive and often unnecessary. When investigation finally commenced, the first indication of irregularity came not from the survey corridor, but from Station 47 itself. The pilot tasked with flying into the settlement reported being unable to raise anyone on the radio despite multiple attempts during approach. Upon landing, the pilot found the community apparently deserted. Doors to several structures stood open despite freezing temperatures. The diesel generator was silent, fuel supply adequate but equipment shut down. No smoke rose from any chimney. No tracks marked recent movement through snow that had fallen 2 days prior. The pilot conducted a brief search of the immediate area, calling out and checking several buildings. No one responded. No evidence of struggle or violence was observed. Personal belongings remained in dwellings as though occupants had simply stepped away momentarily and failed to return. The pilot departed to report the situation, returning the following day with 2 territorial officers and additional supplies. A more thorough search was conducted. Every structure in the settlement was entered and examined. Food remained in storage, clothing hung in closets, tools lay arranged on workbenches. In several dwellings, stoves contained cold ash and partially burned wood, suggesting they had been in use shortly before being abandoned. Beds were unmade. A few tables held dishes from interrupted meals. In one cabin, a journal lay open to an entry dated 5 days prior to the investigation team's arrival. The entry was brief and unremarkable, discussing weather conditions and plans for checking trap lines. Nothing in the text suggested distress, urgency, or anticipation of imminent departure. Tomlin's assigned cabin showed similar patterns. Survey equipment remained neatly organized. Field notes were stacked on a small table, the most recent dated 8 days prior to the investigation. A detailed map of the survey corridor was spread across a makeshift desk, marked with annotated waypoints and elevation notations. The surveyor's personal effects were present but minimal, consistent with someone expecting to remain only a few weeks. A sleeping bag lay unrolled on a narrow cot. A small camp stove held a pot containing frozen remnants of what appeared to be soup or stew. Battery-powered lanterns sat on the floor, batteries dead. Nothing suggested preparation for departure, emergency evacuation, or anything other than routine daily activity that had been inexplicably interrupted. The investigation expanded to surrounding areas. Search teams on snow machines conducted sweeps extending outward from the settlement in all directions. They found nothing. No tracks, no camps, no evidence of human presence. The forest was empty and silent, except for wind and the occasional movement of wildlife. Temperatures during the search period remained well below freezing, with nighttime lows dropping below -30. Survival in such conditions without adequate shelter and supplies would have been extremely difficult, particularly for any extended duration. Yet no bodies were discovered, no abandoned gear located, no indicators of distress or emergency response observed. Attention turned to the structural complex Tomlin had mentioned in the final coherent transmission. Coordinates provided during that communication were used to locate the site. It was found approximately 14 kilometers north-northwest of Station 47, accessible only by difficult overland travel through dense forest and across frozen muskeg. The site consisted of 7 structures arranged as Tomlin had described. The buildings were indeed partially buried by accumulated snow and appeared to have been abandoned for many years. Construction methods suggested mid-century origin, possibly associated with mineral exploration or early surveying activity. Interiors were largely empty, stripped of anything useful or valuable. Floors were littered with debris, collapsed ceiling panels, and ice formations where moisture had penetrated and frozen. No documentation was found that might identify the site's original purpose or operators. Of particular note was a single structure at the center of the complex, larger than the others and more substantially constructed. Its interior contained the remains of what appeared to be communication equipment, long since rendered non-functional by exposure and deterioration. Rusted metal frameworks suggested antenna mounts, and fragments of wire indicated extensive cabling that had once connected various components. The purpose of such equipment in such a location was unclear. The site was far from any communication networks, and the era of its apparent construction predated satellite technology that might have justified remote installations. The formal investigation into the disappearance of Avery Tomlin and the residents of Station 47 began with systematic documentation of physical evidence. Photographs were taken of every structure, interior and exterior. Items of potential significance were catalogued, though determining what might be significant proved challenging given the absence of any clear indication of what had occurred. Personal documents were collected where found, including identification papers, correspondence, financial records, and miscellaneous writings. These materials were examined for clues regarding residents' backgrounds, connections, and possible motivations for sudden departure. The results were largely uninformative. Most documents were routine, revealing little beyond mundane details of daily life in an isolated community. Attempts were made to identify and locate individuals who had resided at Station 47. This proved more difficult than anticipated. Many residents had used only first names or nicknames in their interactions with one another. Legal identifications found in the settlement often appeared to be outdated or potentially falsified. Cross-referencing with territorial registration databases yielded minimal results. Several individuals were tentatively identified based on physical descriptions provided by occasional visitors to the settlement, but tracking their subsequent whereabouts was unsuccessful. It was as though they had simply dissolved back into the vast anonymity of the Northern Territories, if they had ever existed in official records at all. Radio logs from the weeks preceding the disappearance were reviewed in detail. Tomlin's transmissions were analyzed for any indication of distress, confusion, or awareness of developing problems. The fourth week's delayed transmission was reconsidered in light of subsequent events. Had the delay represented something more significant than equipment difficulty? The brevity of that communication, initially unremarkable, now seemed potentially meaningful. But the content itself provided no concrete evidence of anything amiss beyond the technical challenges of conducting survey work in harsh conditions. The fifth week's transmission, with its references to the mysterious structural complex and apparent atmospheric interference, received particular scrutiny. Technical specialists examined recordings of that transmission. The interference was confirmed as unusual but not unprecedented. It did not match known patterns of atmospheric disturbance, equipment malfunction, or intentional jamming. The fragmented nature of the transmission suggested possible signal degradation due to localized conditions, but the specific cause could not be determined. More puzzling were brief segments of audio that seemed to contain voices other than Tomlin's, though whether these represented actual separate speakers or artifacts of signal processing was impossible to establish conclusively. The quality was simply too poor to permit reliable analysis. Efforts were made to establish a timeline of events at Station 47. This required piecing together fragmentary evidence from multiple sources. The last confirmed external contact with the settlement was a radio communication 9 days before the investigation team's arrival, involving a routine supply coordination discussion. That conversation had been unremarkable, with no indication of problems or concerns. The journal entry found in one cabin, dated 5 days before arrival, suggested at least some residents were present and engaged in normal activities at that point. The frozen food in Tomlin's cabin, based on estimates of freezing rates at prevailing temperatures, suggested abandonment perhaps 3 to 4 days before discovery. These timeframes were imprecise and potentially inconsistent, but they suggested evacuation had occurred relatively recently, within a narrow window of days preceding the investigation. Search operations continued for several weeks, expanding outward from Station 47 in progressively wider radius. Aircraft conducted aerial surveys of the surrounding region, looking for any sign of human activity, camps, tracks, or disturbance. Ground teams revisited the structural complex multiple times, examining it more thoroughly and searching surrounding areas for additional clues. Side-scanning sonar was used to examine the river and nearby lakes for any indication of accidents or deliberate concealment. All efforts produced no significant results. The landscape revealed nothing. The missing individuals had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Inquiries were made with other remote communities in the general region, though distances involved meant such communities were days of travel away, even under good conditions. No one reported unusual visitors, unexpected arrivals, or knowledge of Station 47's residents. This was not particularly surprising. The Northern Territories were vast and sparsely populated, and individuals moved through them with minimal documentation or observation. A person could travel hundreds of kilometers and encounter no one, could relocate to a different area entirely without leaving any trace of their movement or destination. The wilderness itself was the perfect medium for disappearance, offering endless space to absorb those who wished to vanish. Theories began to emerge among investigators, though none were supported by compelling evidence. One suggestion held that residents had collectively decided to abandon the settlement, perhaps in response to some shared concern about impending regulatory action or resource depletion. This seemed implausible given the abrupt nature of the departure and the personal belongings left behind. People do not typically abandon functional communities and all their possessions without clear cause. Another theory proposed that Tomlin had discovered something during survey work that prompted evacuation, though what that discovery might have been and why it would require immediate departure remained unexplained. More troubling speculations focused on the structural complex Tomlin had reported. Could it have been associated with activities that residents of Station 47 were aware of and involved in? Had Tomlin's survey work brought unwanted attention to something that was meant to remain unobserved? These questions led nowhere productive. The complex itself yielded no evidence of recent activity, and its original purpose remained obscure. If it was connected to the disappearances, that connection existed only as abstract possibility, unsupported by physical evidence or logical mechanism. Environmental factors were considered. Could some sudden meteorological event have forced evacuation? Weather records from the period showed nothing unusual. Temperatures were typical, precipitation normal, wind speeds unremarkable. Could there have been a carbon monoxide incident affecting multiple structures simultaneously? This seemed unlikely given that stoves in different buildings would have produced independent emissions, and the open nature of the settlement would have prevented widespread accumulation. Could wildlife have posed a threat? Predators were present in the region, but attacks on humans were extremely rare, and certainly not of a nature that would affect an entire community simultaneously. As weeks passed without breakthrough, the investigation began to lose momentum. Resources were limited, and the absence of any clear evidence of criminal activity made it difficult to justify continued intensive effort. The file remained open technically, but active investigation ceased. In the years following the abandonment of Station 47, various explanations have been proposed by those aware of the case. None have been officially endorsed, and most remain purely speculative, constructed from fragmentary information and the human tendency to create narratives that impose order on ambiguity. The most prosaic explanation suggests coordinated voluntary departure. According to this interpretation, residents of Station 47 became aware of impending administrative attention, possibly triggered by Tomlin's official survey work, and collectively decided to disperse before questions could be asked about their unofficial community, unregistered economic activities, or personal backgrounds they preferred to keep private. This theory accounts for the lack of violence or struggle, but struggles to explain the abandoned personal belongings and the apparent haste of departure. People engaged in deliberate, planned evacuation typically take their possessions, particularly in regions where replacing essential items is difficult and expensive. Moreover, coordinated mass departure requires communication and agreement among all involved parties. While Station 47's residents may have been connected by shared circumstances, they were not a cohesive organization with command structure or unified decision-making processes. Achieving consensus for collective action of that nature would have required time and discussion that should have left traces in journals, conversations overheard by investigators, or subsequent communications. Another perspective focuses on Tomlin's discovery of the structural complex. This explanation proposes that the site was not as abandoned as it appeared, that it remained in use for purposes unknown, and that Tomlin's intrusion triggered response from parties with strong motivation to maintain secrecy. Station 47's residents, according to this scenario, were either complicit in activities associated with the site or were eliminated as potential witnesses to prevent information leakage. This interpretation veers toward conspiracy, requiring the existence of organized actors capable of swift, complete removal of 30-plus individuals while leaving no physical evidence of their intervention. Such scenarios are difficult to credit without supporting evidence. The structural complex showed every indication of decades-long abandonment. The remote location, far from transportation networks or resource infrastructure, made ongoing covert operations logistically improbable. Most significantly, the complete absence of tracks, disturbance, or physical evidence of third-party presence contradicts the notion of forced evacuation. Moving 30 individuals against their will through trackless winter wilderness would require vehicles, personnel, and coordination that could not be executed without leaving extensive traces. The snow surrounding Station 47 was undisturbed except by search teams' own activities. More abstractly, some have suggested environmental or geological events. Localized seismic activity, though rare in the region, could theoretically have caused ground instability that prompted evacuation. However, geological surveys conducted after the disappearances detected no recent seismic events, and no physical damage to structures consistent with ground movement was observed. Gas emissions from permafrost or underground sources were considered. Methane or other gases could theoretically accumulate in low-lying areas, creating hazardous conditions. But Station 47 occupied slightly elevated terrain with good air circulation, and no chemical traces were detected during investigation. Some theories emphasize psychological factors. Extended isolation, harsh conditions, and the social dynamics of small, closed communities can produce stress, paranoia, and collective behavior patterns that appear irrational to outside observers. Could residents have developed shared beliefs or anxieties that prompted mass departure? Historical precedents exist for communities abandoning settlements based on rumors, fears, or charismatic individuals convincing groups to relocate. But such movements typically involve observable preparation, communication with outside parties about new destinations, and eventual resurfacing of at least some participants. None of that occurred with Station 47. The structural complex itself has generated independent speculation. Its original purpose remains unverified, but most analysis suggests it was associated with mid-20th century resource exploration or possibly early Cold War-era communication installations. The remote location would have been desirable for certain types of equipment requiring isolation from electromagnetic interference. The abandonment timeline appears consistent with technological obsolescence or project cancellation. That it might retain significance decades later seems improbable, yet its proximity to Station 47 and Tomlin's specific mention of it in final communications creates an association that is difficult to dismiss entirely, despite absence of logical connection. Weather-related theories persist despite lack of meteorological evidence. Blizzards can disorient travelers, cold can kill quickly, and whiteout conditions can cause individuals to become lost within meters of shelter. But the weather during the relevant period was not extreme by regional standards. Moreover, multiple individuals with extensive northern experience would not have all simultaneously made fatal navigation errors, and bodies would have been discovered during subsequent searches unless removed or concealed by deliberate action, which returns the scenario to questions of who would have done so and why. Accidental contamination of food or water supplies has been suggested. Chemical or biological agents could theoretically have affected residents, causing illness, confusion, or behavior changes. But no evidence of such contamination was found during investigation. Food supplies tested showed no unusual substances, and water sources appeared uncontaminated. If illness had struck, some indication would likely remain in the form of medical supplies deployed, journal entries describing symptoms, or physical evidence of sickness. None was observed. The most unsettling explanation is the simplest, that no adequate explanation exists, that the circumstances were genuinely anomalous, representing a convergence of factors so improbable that they produced an outcome that defies conventional analysis. This interpretation abandons the search for logical mechanism and instead accepts mystery as inherent and irreducible. It is an unsatisfying conclusion for investigators trained to pursue resolution, but it may be the only honest assessment given available evidence. What remains clear is that approximately 30 individuals, including Avery Tomlin, were present in a remote northern settlement and then were not. The transition from presence to absence occurred rapidly, within a span of days. No remains were recovered, no subsequent sightings confirmed, no communications received. Station 47 no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The structures remain, deteriorating gradually under the assault of successive freeze-thaw cycles, accumulating snow and wind-driven ice. Roofs have begun to collapse, walls to lean inward, foundations to settle unevenly as permafrost shifts beneath them. Within another decade, the site will be difficult to distinguish from the surrounding forest, except as irregular mounds of weathered wood, slowly being reclaimed by moss and lichen. No one has returned to occupy the settlement. Its brief existence has been noted in archival records, but forgotten in practical terms, relevant only to those few individuals who encounter the case file and wonder what occurred in that remote place during early spring of a year that now seems very distant. Avery Tomlin's name appears in no subsequent records. The surveyor's disappearance was reported to family contacts listed in employment records, but those contacts proved outdated or incorrect. Efforts to locate relatives were unsuccessful. Tomlin exists now only as an entry in missing persons databases that are seldom consulted and as the central figure in an investigation that reached no conclusion. The survey work the individual was hired to complete was never finished, and the proposed forestry road was never constructed. The corporation that issued the contract dissolved, its records scattered or destroyed, leaving no institutional memory of the project or the surveyor who vanished while attempting to assess its feasibility. The residents of Station 47 are similarly absent from ongoing records. A few names were tentatively established during investigation, but even those identifications remain uncertain. Most have no verified identity beyond descriptions in witness statements or fragmentary documentation found in abandoned dwellings. They came from elsewhere, lived briefly in collective isolation, and disappeared without trace. Whether they are alive somewhere, having successfully established new identities and resumed lives unconnected to their time at Station 47, or whether they met some fate in the wilderness that claimed all physical evidence of their end, remains unknown. The structural complex north of the settlement has been visited occasionally by researchers attempting to determine its original purpose. Consensus suggests early communication or monitoring installation, possibly related to atmospheric research or Cold War surveillance networks. Its exact function may never be established with certainty. Documents that would clarify its history have not been located and may no longer exist. The site itself continues to deteriorate, gradually erasing physical evidence that might otherwise support analysis. Eventually, it too will return to the landscape, indistinguishable from natural geological features. Questions persist but are asked less frequently with each passing year. Those who were directly involved in the investigation have retired or moved to other assignments. Institutional memory fades. New cases demand attention and resources. The file on Station 47 gathers dust in archival storage, occasionally retrieved by researchers interested in unusual cold cases or anomalous disappearances, but producing no new insights. The passage of time has not revealed answers. It has only increased the distance between the event and the present, making resolution progressively less likely with each decade. The region itself remains largely unchanged. The forest continues its slow growth, indifferent to human presence or absence. Lakes freeze and thaw in annual cycles. Rivers flow north toward distant watersheds. Wildlife moves through the landscape, following patterns established long before human arrival and likely to continue long after any human departure. The wilderness possesses a quality of permanence that makes individual events, no matter how mysterious or troubling, seem transient and ultimately insignificant. People come, people go. The forest remains. For those interested in cold cases, Station 47 represents a particular type of frustration. The investigation that proceeds correctly, follows proper procedures, examines available evidence thoroughly, yet reaches no conclusion because the evidence itself is insufficient. There is no dramatic breakthrough waiting to be discovered through renewed analysis, no overlooked clue that will suddenly illuminate the truth. The case is simply incomplete, lacking the critical pieces of information necessary for resolution. It will remain incomplete unless someone directly involved chooses to provide information, and the likelihood of that occurring diminishes with each passing year. The psychological impact on investigators who worked the case varied. Some accepted the lack of resolution as an inevitable aspect of investigative work, understanding that not all questions have answers and not all disappearances can be explained. Others found the case troubling precisely because it offered so little to work with, no clear direction for inquiry, no obvious suspects or scenarios. The absence of violence or apparent struggle was in some ways more disturbing than if evidence of conflict had been discovered. At least conflict would provide narrative structure, cause and effect, comprehensible human motivation. The alternative, inexplicable abandonment, suggested either carefully concealed truth or genuine anomaly, and neither possibility offered comfort. What can be said with certainty is limited but significant. A community existed in a remote region of the Northern Territories, operating outside formal administrative recognition. It sustained itself for a period of years through combination of traditional subsistence activities and marginal economic participation. A contract surveyor arrived to conduct work in the vicinity and subsequently disappeared, along with every other resident of the settlement. Extensive investigation produced no evidence explaining the disappearances or establishing the fate of those involved. The site was abandoned and remains unoccupied. The individuals have not been located. The case remains open in technical terms, but inactive in practical terms. For Avery Tomlin's family, if any exist, who maintain awareness of the situation, there is no closure. For the families of Station 47's other residents, assuming any such families exist and were aware of their relatives' location, the same absence of resolution persists. For investigators who devoted weeks to searching frozen wilderness and examining empty buildings, there is the lingering dissatisfaction of incomplete work. For those who encounter the case file in archives, there is a brief moment of curiosity and speculation before moving on to other matters. The case occupies a strange position, neither forgotten nor remembered, neither solved nor actively pursued. It exists in a kind of stasis, suspended between past event and present awareness, unlikely to be resolved but unable to be fully dismissed. The Northern Territories contain many such stories. Settlements that appeared and disappeared, individuals who vanished without explanation, events that defy easy categorization or understanding. The scale of the landscape and the harshness of conditions create circumstances where conventional assumptions about human behavior and investigative methodology sometimes fail to produce expected results. People can disappear completely, leaving minimal trace, Communities can exist beyond administrative awareness. Events can occur that are never adequately witnessed or documented. This is the nature of wilderness environments and the human presence within them. Fragile, transient, subject to forces and factors that remain imperfectly understood despite our tools and technologies and investigative procedures. Station 47 is a designation that appears on a handful of documents in archived files. It refers to a place that briefly existed and no longer does, to people who were present and then were not, to questions that were asked but not answered. The case remains as it began, a mystery without solution, a disappearance without explanation, a file that documents the absence of information rather than its presence. Those who seek clear narratives and definitive conclusions will find none here. What exists instead is ambiguity, uncertainty, and the quiet acknowledgement that some events resist explanation despite our best efforts to impose understanding upon them. The forest keeps its secrets. The wilderness offers no testimony.